Welcome to Politics, Law, and Life. They say that justice is elusive and sometimes hard to find. Well, we're a family of lawyers, and seeking justice is not just our family's calling, it's our family's passion. I'm Lonnie Johnson. Along with my wife and family, we're exposing how politics, law, and everyday life intersect. We bring perspectives informed by politics, sharpened by the law, and refined by our individual life experiences. So join us in the discussion, Politics, Law, and Life, where every story finds its verdict. Welcome to Politics, Law, and Life, where every story finds its verdict. You might notice that today is a little bit different. Today I'm here alone. And that's because I want to come and talk about two very specific things. One being the situation we're in with respect to TSA, and the other being the SAVE Act. And we're going to take those in that sequence. One, let's talk about TSA. Now, TSA falls under Homeland Security and the Homeland Security budget. There are a number of other things that falls under TSA, under Homeland Security, including FEMA, ICE. And one of the problems we're having right now is Democrats are saying we're not willing to fund ICE in its current condition, with its current practices. And let's explore that. Why is that? Well, we have federal law enforcement, we have state law enforcement, we have local law enforcement, and they all operate in the open, with no mask, with badge numbers, so that if there's a problem, you can look and see who it is that's causing that problem and report it and have it investigated. It's only ICE that has to come in with mask. You don't know who the person is behind the mask. It could be a real ICE officer. It could be someone just looking to kidnap someone. We don't know because they're coming in with masks on. It's only ICE that says we don't have to have a judicial warrant to come barging into your home. Now, all other law enforcement, they operate within the Constitution, and they require a judicial warrant to come into your home. For some reason, we say for ICE, that's a different situation. That's the big disagreement between Democrats and Republicans, and why Democrats is holding up funding. They're saying we need to have some reforms as to how you operate. We can't have you just operating considering some of the problems we've had in recent months with the killing of people by ICE officers. We need to put some restraints there, or some constraints around how you operate, starting with take the mask off, let people see who you are, have a badge number, have body cams. Let us be able to tell exactly what's going on. That's the controversy. Now, why is it affecting us with respect to TSA? That's a choice. There's a clear choice that the administration has made. Ask yourself, we're still, we have the budget and Homeland Security. They continue to fund ICE. They continue to pay bonuses for people to come join ICE, the $50,000 bonuses. They're funding ICE every day. But they chose not to fund TSA. Why is that? Ask yourself, why would they make the decision not to fund TSA and say, oh, it's because Democrats won't vote for our bill, so we have no choice. We have to shut it down. Government is shut down. TSA is shut down because Homeland Security doesn't have a budget. Homeland Security has money. Remember the big, beautiful bill that gave them all the money? They have the money. This is a political act. And what the political calculation is, if we take money away from ICE and not fund that, nobody's going to be really bothered by it. But if we shut down funding, stop paying people at TSA, and start getting these long lines where people are the general public is suffering every day, now we'll force Democrats to capitulate and pass a budget that includes funding for ICE as it stands. And we continue operating business as usual. Well, I'm calling on every Democrat, and I hope you will do the same thing, to tell them, hold the line. If they continue to want to make, and that's the choice, Republicans are saying, the administration is saying, we want to make the general public suffer. Because if we make them suffer enough, then they will call upon their elected officials and make them act, make them capitulate. That's the choice, that's the calculation they're making. And I'm saying, I will suffer at the airport and go through that before I have ICE going in, abducting people in broad daylight, busting in people's house without judicial warrants. But we shouldn't have to make that choice. We shouldn't have to make that choice. We should be saying to our senators, if you really want to get this thing resolved, tell ICE to do what everyone else does, what all other law enforcement is doing. Tell ICE, take the mask off. Turn on the body cameras. Get a judicial warrant. If we can get a judicial warrant for everything else, why can't we do it for ICE? So that's the ICE part. Now let's talk about the SAVE Act. Every time you hear a Republican lawmaker talk about the SAVE Act, they bring in things like, well, look, we just want to give IDs. We want people to have an ID to vote. We don't want to have people who are not U.S. citizens voting, and so let's make them prove their citizenship. I love it when they say, you use the ID to rent a car. You use the ID to check into a hotel. You use the ID, and they go through the long list of things we use the ID for. That's not their bill. Because the ID we use for those things most commonly is our driver's license. But their bill says, a driver's license is not good enough. The two things they say you need to have is a passport or a birth certificate. When was the last time you used a passport or a birth certificate to rent a car? It doesn't work. When was the last time you used a passport as the required thing to get into a club or to get into any other things they list on their list? Now, there are places that will accept that, but they will also accept your driver's license. So don't fall for the thing and we're just trying to look for ID, because that's not what they're doing. And why is that a problem? Well, I'll give you two reasons. One, when you look at passports, most people don't have a passport. And if you're not leaving the country, why do you need it? Why are we going to tell people to exercise your constitutional right to vote, you have to pay to get a passport? Sound like a poll tax to me. It's a constitutional right to vote. Why should you have to pay to get a passport just so you can vote? It makes no sense. Ask yourself, why is that required? And then the birth certificate. Every woman who got married and chose to go with take her husband's last name, her birth certificate doesn't work. She has to go get a birth certificate with her married name on it, because the birth certificate has to match the name that's actually of the person that's voting. Now, I heard a senator recently say, well, women can figure it out. It's not a question of whether women are smart. They can figure it out. But why should they have to? And that takes me to the next point. Why are we doing all these voter ID laws? Why are we doing this? Why are we spending hundreds of millions of dollars changing the voting system? It's to satisfy the ego of one man who can't admit that he lost an election in 2020. And I was a trial lawyer. And one of the things we used to say to juries is, you don't have to leave your common sense at the door. Take a common sense approach as you analyze these facts and come up with your verdict. Well, I'm asking you to do the same thing. Now ask yourself, in 2020, when Donald Trump lost, Republicans still had control of the House. They won control of the Senate. If Democrats were somehow going to rig the election to keep Trump from winning, why didn't we rig it enough so we could get Republican seats, take over some Republican seats and win the House? Why didn't we rig it enough to take over the Senate? It makes no sense. Every person who ran for re-election or was elected in 2020, all the Republicans that won elections, they would have you believe that somehow they rigged it for the president, but they allowed them to win. That makes absolutely no sense. And they know it doesn't make sense. But yet, Donald Trump has filed numerous lawsuits with Republican judges, with Democratic judges. Not one time did he find a lawsuit where he won and someone said, yes, there were irregularities in the election that caused you to lose. He cannot, with his frail ego, admit that he lost an election. And so we're doing all this because they're afraid to say to him, and don't take my word for it, look at the hearings. Look at anytime they're asked questions. I'm talking about Republicans who won election in 2020. If you ask them, did Donald Trump win the presidential election in 2020? They won't answer. They'll say, well, Joe Biden was president. Joe Biden became president. They will never say that Donald Trump lost because they're afraid of him. Why are they afraid of him? Because they want to keep their seat. And we've seen what he does. If anyone disagrees with him. Remember back in 2016 when he said, when I'm elected, I'm going to bring in the best and brightest people. The best and brightest, the smartest people. That's what he told us. And then, one by one, when they start saying, Mr. President, you can't do this stuff. This is not right. Each one of them became stupid when they opposed him on anything. That's why when he ran for re-election, 40 of the top 44 people who worked for him did not support his re-election. After they came and served him as president, in whatever role they were in, when they departed ways with him, they were low IQ, they were morons, they were not smart, they idiots. I mean, he had a name for everyone that opposed him. And these members of the House, members of the Senate, they go along with his charades because they're afraid that if they say something against him, he'll oppose them at re-election and they'll lose their seat. So they have to sit there and waffle and say, when you ask them a straight question, did Donald Trump win the 2020 election? They won't answer. And they're going through this SAVE Act and all these other things that they're doing with securing elections because they don't want to have to admit that he lost an election. And ask yourself this. Now, if you look at the Brennan Institute, they said they found 30 instances of people who are not citizens trying to vote. Other studies have said, I think they came up with like 70. That's 70 over 40 years. 40 years, you got 70 cases of someone who was not a U.S. citizen trying to vote. Does that justify all the things we're doing? Does that justify changing our whole system of voting? Because 70 people out of billions of people who voted over all this time, in 40 years, 70 people who are not a U.S. citizen trying to vote. Where are the prosecutions? You know, every time we have a school shooting, you hear Republicans saying, Democrats say we should pass some sensible gun laws to cut down on these school shootings. You know, make it harder for people to get guns. What do you hear on the other side? Republicans say, we have laws on the books. And so it's not that we need to come up with more laws, we just need to enforce the laws that we have. Well, obviously those laws are not working as intended because we're still having school shootings. But look at on the other side. The voting laws are working. If we've only had 70 cases of someone trying to vote over 40 years, I would say it's working pretty good. But yet we would need to revamp the entire system and ask yourself why. Yes, we can end up with we can give people passports free, or we can, but why are we going through that? Why are we doing all these things? Just to satisfy the ego of one man who can't admit that he lost an election. Now, keep in mind, there's more to the SAVE Act than just this so-called ID issue. They've thrown a lot of things in there. One of the things that I found extremely interesting is this whole idea that we need to protect women's sports from men who will get a sex change operation so they can get a medal. I mean, that's the logic. They're saying you got some guys out there who they want to win a medal in sports, so they're going to get a sex change operation just so they can get a medal in competing in women's sports. I saw Senator Thune on the floor giving this impassioned speech about why the SAVE Act needs to address the issue of men in women's sports. What he said was, they did this extensive study, and there have been 600 and something women who lost out on 800 and something medals in 26 or 29 sports. 600 women, let's give it 700 because the 600 plus wouldn't change. So we'll say 700 women missed out on 800, we'll say even 900 medals in 29 sports. Is that a problem? Yes, it's a problem. Is that a problem that requires a fix with federal legislation? Absolutely not. We have so many other problems out there, and especially when you look at the big picture. The big picture it says to me, okay, you're telling me you're trying to protect women's sports by saying you're going to protect them from a guy who wants to get a sex change operation and get a medal. And at the same time, you're decimating the Department of Education. The reason women's sports have made the strides they've made is because of Title IX. And Title IX is enforced by the Department of Education. It's investigated. Abuses are investigated by the Department of Education. When Doge came in and fired all those people from the Department of Education, one of the things hit hard was the folks who would normally investigate Title IX offenses. So you have this big backlog of complaints made by women who say, I've been sexually abused in my quest to do women's sports. I've had the funding that they're supposed to be providing under the law, they're not providing. Everything dealing with women's sports that had investigations in the Department of Education to watch out for that, that's gone. So under the guise of protecting sports on one hand, you're eliminating women's sports on the other hand. Make that make sense. I'm just saying, let's take a reasonable approach. Let's stop and look at the big picture. Quit following the little shiny object. When they throw out one, something that sounds like, oh yeah, that's really bad. Ask how many people is affected. If we want to, and I know every case matters. I'm not trying to say that it doesn't matter, but I'm saying, does it require a federal response? When we can't find 100 cases that have been prosecuted of people voting who are not U.S. citizens, do we need a federal response to address that? Do we need legislation to address that? And is it worth having TSA people not being paid to force the hand to say, we're going to keep ICE operating the way they are? Good. Look, you don't have to see things the way I see it. But I ask at least you look at it. Start asking yourself some tough questions. And more importantly, call your senator. Especially if you have a Republican senator. Call your senator and ask him to make it make sense. Ask them to explain to you why it is that Homeland Security does not take ICE funding and use that to pay TSA people. Why have they made a conscious decision to make the TSA people suffer and thereby the American people? They want to put maximum pressure on you and me. Say if they do that, that'll make Democrats capitulate. Ask them why is it they have to have passport and birth certificate as the only means of being able to register to vote. Why is that? Why can't we use just use a driver's license? Like that's examples they use. So why can't we use a driver's license? And yes, I know driver's license. For those who say that's discriminatory, yes, I know the court found the driver's license requirement to be discriminatory, but at least that's not as bad as requiring a birth certificate or a passport. Again, just let it make sense. Let's do the things that make sense. Let's demand our lawmakers do things that make sense. Yes, let's bring in federal legislation where it's needed. But if it's not needed, if we don't need a federal bill to cover a small handful of instances. Those are issues we call wedge issues. The only reason they're throwing them out is to divide you, to get you thinking about this and bog down on things like men participating in women's sports, and at the same time they're eliminating women's sports by eliminating part of education. And you're over here focusing on, well, I don't want some guy getting a sex change operation and having to compete with my daughter. Look at the big picture. And when you do, call your senator and tell them you expect more of them. Tell them if they want to do political stunts like shutting down TSA, that you're not going to vote for them. Tell them to call Homeland Security and tell them to start paying TSA people. If they need money, take it from ICE. Stop paying ICE. I guarantee you, if they were put in a situation where they had to, if they want to shut down ICE, if they had to shut down funding for ICE, if they shut down funding for TSA would be fully paid. Because they are not going to shut down ICE. So there's your homework. Call your senator. Make them answer the tough questions. And don't fall for it. It's the Democrats. Now, tell me, why is it that Democrats didn't make a decision to stop funding ICE? The administration did. So, thank you for joining another episode of Politics, Law, and Life. Again, every story finds its verdict. If it's nothing more than to have you think about what's going on around us. If you agree or disagree, if you like the discussion, hit the subscribe button below. Because nothing else, we want to make sure we have a discussion where we start at least think about the things that's going on around us. Thanks again. This has been Politics, Law, and Life, where every story finds its verdict. Hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks.